I'm going to talk a little bit about the final exam. Okay. So the final exam is a week from Wednesday. A week from Wednesday. And let's see.
You want me to make him a co-host?
I was trying to and I couldn't do it. If you can do it, you do it. All right. So a week from Wednesday is our final exam. It will open up at 8 a.m. in the morning, Central Standard Time. Okay. It will close at midnight, Central Standard Time. Okay. So that is how long it will be open. It'll be open for approximately, well, not approximately, it'll be open for 16 hours. Okay. During that 16 hours, you will have a 2-hour window, to complete the final exam. That's why it's worth more than your others. It's because it's a little bit longer, okay? But in some ways, I think it's a little bit easier. So what I have decided to do is this. There will be 30 multiple choice questions that will come directly from this last section. They will be from either Cengage or from lecture, most from Cengage, but some from lecture, 30 multiple choice questions. There will be an additional 20 multiple choice questions, 10 from each of the previous 2 sections. So think about that, just 10 questions from each of those sections. So what sort of questions am I going to ask? I'm going to ask really technical, difficult, you have to dig for the answer sort of questions. No, I'm not. I'm going to ask super easy questions. Like, you know, what are the 2 houses of Congress? You guys, if you're looking at me blankly, I'm going to be very upset. Jackson wants the answer to that. What are the 2 chambers of Congress, Jackson? Come
on. Senate and the House of Republicans, some House of Representatives.
Of Representatives, close. All right, you got the first 2 letters. Okay, fair enough. Okay, so you guys all have the answer to that question even, okay? So that's one of those 20 questions. Look, you already have one of the multiple choice questions answered for you. You know what it is, okay? I'm going to give you a little bit of direction. In the study guide that I post on Wednesday. All right, so 50 multiple choice questions. They will each be worth 1.5 points. That's 75% of your exam. 25% of your exam is this question. You ready? Name and explain 3 problems with the U.S. federal government or that are problems the U.S. federal government can solve, and give a solution for each. That's it. So you've already written a paper over 1, right? So I would use that one. Okay? I would use that one. So come up with 2 more. 3 major problems in the United States today need to be dealt with by the U.S. federal government. Identify it, explain it, and give a solution for it. There must be an introduction with a thesis statement. There must be a conclusion that wraps up.
Wait, so this is for what again? Could you say that one more time? I kind of missed that part where we just said what this was for.
The final exam.
Oh, okay.
So the final exam essay, which is worth 25% of your grade on the final exam, is just 1 question, and I'm giving it to you right now.
Will we be able to copy and paste, or will there be a lock on the screen?
You know, I'm not sure. I don't think it'll lock because of the requirements of browsers. So I couldn't do it before. So you can do that, so you can write it in advance. I'm okay with that. Okay. As a note, we talked about the rubric today, so I'm going to tell you what the rubric is. you'll get 5 points for the introduction. 2 of those points will be for the thesis statement. Okay? You'll get 5 points for each identification, explanation, and solution. So identification, 1 point. Explanation, 2 points. Solution, 2 points. That's going to happen 3 times. And then your conclusion will be worth 3 points. So you guys are keeping track. You're like, we are 2 points short. Here's the 2 points. Cite something in some recognizable form inside that essay. You can cite lecture. You can cite your textbook. You can cite that work that you did to write your paper. Okay? Some recognizable form. Yes. As Eric says, according to Dr. Rowlett.
According to this governmental agency, or
according to the USIA, according to the EPA, right? Pretty basic. The textbook says.
Not yourself, not your dad, not your mom, not your buddy.
Thank you, Michelle.
Yep.
Not your dad, not your mom, not you, not Facebook, not Wikipedia, people. All right.
oh, and I'll just say, since you can write this essay early, it's probably a good idea to write the essay early, because then you could have a much more well-developed essay and it'll look much cleaner.
Jack is asking for how long of an essay I'm looking for. Well, it's worth 1/4 of your grade on your final exam. It's got to be at least 5 paragraphs, right? Don't quote your paper exactly, right? I mean, you can. I'm just saying, cite something that you used in your paper, right? Cite a source that you use to support yourself in your paper.
We're not a researcher.
Don't cite yourself, okay? All right, I am going to turn it over to Will. All right, and everyone, I would like to introduce you to Will Livingston, and Eric is going to take attendance as I'm doing this introduction. Will Livingston is a PhD graduate student at the University of Oklahoma. One of the things that he studies is international relations and politics, and so he is going to talk to you about that today. Attendance is live. Okay, Will, it's all you.
All right, and am I coming through? Wonderful. Okay, hi everybody. Nice to meet you all. I'm going to be switching over to share my screen, so hopefully it's working good and we can see that. I think it is. So this is my presentation for national security. As Melody mentioned, I have studied it in the past. I have a master's degree already in international security, and I'm pursuing further education on the topic. So hopefully this will be helpful. I can't really see the chat right now. So if you would like to ask questions or anything, please wait till the end and I'd be happy to answer any questions and do what I can. So without further ado, let's get started. So these are the topics we're going to be discussing in the presentation. Just to give you a brief overview of how it's going to go, we're going to talk about kind of the history of national security, how from the founding to the development of NATO. Then we're going to get into the different theories of national security, realism, democratic peace theory, and constructivism. Then we're going to talk about interests of the US government in their national security, which we'll lay out later. And then we'll talk about the modern presidents. So that should be fun and seem a little more relevant than all this stuffy stuff from the past. So to start with the historic sense of national security, I have 2 of our first presidents, first and third. These are quotes from them. It's during George Washington's farewell address to the nation after he was done with his 8 years as president. He said, "It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliance with any portion of the foreign world." This is, of course, after a couple wars with war with England to gain independence, and he understood at the time that the U.S. was a small country. It was 13 colonies. It didn't have much of anything of a navy. It had no real ability to project power in the world. I mean, there was no Air Force at the time, so your Navy was your military power abroad. The U.S., I mean, all we had was Mexico and Canada to consider. We couldn't do anything in Europe to deal with them. That perspective of George Washington continued, again expressed by Thomas Jefferson with his comment, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. And we will get into entangling alliances now. So these are those two quotes, you can keep them in mind, but this is a perfect example of what entangling alliance is. This little Venn diagram here should give you a pretty good sense of, is an example of what happened in the lead up to World War I. So famously, Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated, and this is the trigger that causes World War I to occur. But this is why it happened. It's because all these different countries in Europe had all these different alliances where I'm aligned with you, you're aligned with them, they're giving aid to you, they have a treaty with you that if you go to war, I'll go to war. So once one assassination happens and suddenly there's violence between two countries, all these different countries fall in a set of dominoes to where they're all fighting with one another. And so this is exactly what George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were aware of and did not want the US to be involved in. But that was in the 17 to 1800s. This is the 1900s. Times have changed. Woodrow Wilson is president at the time, and up until the World War broke out, the US hasn't been really involved in foreign affairs, and he wanted to keep that. He wanted to focus domestically. He didn't want to worry the US people with the issues of Europe. That's their problem, they'll deal with it. So he just let the war in Europe kind of continue as it was. He's like, they'll sort it out, it's their thing. This happened, of course, until very famously, the Kaiser of Germany sent a communique to Mexico, basically saying, hey, Mexico, if you were to attack the United States, we would maybe be aligned with you and, things would be great. Because of course, the US and the UK had a close relationship, and the UK and Germany were squabbling in World War I. And so they were very concerned with, let's make sure the US, is fighting over there and doesn't start sending troops over to the Europe. That, of course, the US found out, we get involved. And when we get involved with the war, we get involved with the war. Our main efforts were democracy, not victory. We wanted to make the world more democratic, to have more democracies. And I'll get to this later on about why we view more democracies in the US as a beneficial thing in foreign policy. And one thing that this resulted in was the League of Nations. This was an idea of Woodrow Wilson's. It ultimately didn't go through because the US Congress, as we've talked about, has to approve of treaties, and this counts as a treaty, and they didn't want a League of Nations. But what it was is a group of countries all coming together where they would solve international disputes. The US Congress at the time felt that if they agreed to it, then what would happen is some of the authority of making decisions in the US would be given over to other countries, and they weren't comfortable with that at the time. But the most important thing that occurred from World War I is absolutely setting out the groundwork for World War II. Wouldn't have happened without World War I and how it was resolved with the Treaty of Versailles. I won't get into it, but that's more of a history class lesson, but how it was set up, it led directly to the German resentment and World War II. So again, direct result of World War I. In Europe, powers again centralizing. Again, Germany's at the head of it, this time with a chap named Adolf Hitler, who has some pretty sketchy opinions about quite a few things. And the US again is slow to intervene. We had seen what had just happened. We had just been involved with the war and we weren't happy about it. So we didn't really want to do it, get involved again, until eventually it got to the point where it was starting to look like the Germany was going to do a lot of damage. Germany, of course, very famously had a compact with Russia and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which meant that, hey, we won't attack you, you don't attack us. This is Joseph Stalin at the time is in charge of Russia, and very famously, Germany betrayed Russia and attacked it and was fighting a war on two fronts. And Adolf Hitler learned the very unfortunate lesson of history that Napoleon Bonaparte had learned before him, which is you never, ever, ever invade Russia during the winter. You always lose because it's very cold and the Russians are much better at dealing with the cold than you are. No matter what you think, you're going to lose. And ultimately it did. Ultimately Germany did. We'll get into the aftermath of the war, but one of the big things that happened is the United Nations resulted. This was the fulfillment of Woodrow Wilson's goal of a League of Nations years earlier. And the United Nations is what we all know, a group of every country is involved, every country that's internationally recognized is involved. And very famously, it has a P5 Council, which is the 5 major powers at the time of World War I, which were the US, the UK, France, Russia, and China. It's pretty funny to think about that France and even the UK are included because they don't have nearly as much power globally as the other 3 players. Even Russia, you can argue, shouldn't be on it anymore, but they all have what's called veto power, which is the UN can decide any resolution. We're going to sanction this one country for misbehaving. We're going to allow UN troops or approve of a military action between 2 countries. The UN can say whatever they want, but the P5, those 5 people are always on the Security Council and they can always veto it. And if one member of the P5 says no to a policy, it does not pass. This is just a little brief overview of the UN to give you a sense of it. But let's go into the Cold War. So after World War II, Germany is kind of split in half because what happens is the Allied troops, the US, the UK, and what was liberated of France comes in from the West, and Russia comes in from the East, and we split and we both rescue Germany. But what happens is, okay, we're done with World War II. We got rid of that Hitler guy. Life's safe. We're going to have democracy. Let's all go home. And the US and the UK start to leave, and Russia doesn't leave. Russia puts up a fence and says, we're staying, a wall basically, and says, we're staying, we're not leaving. And so the US and UK are like, well, that's not good. I thought everything was peaceful. We were all working together. We got rid of that Hitler guy. We should all be friends. We weren't. There was quite a big contention between the US and Russia about what form of economics to run your country under, capitalism or communism. And hence we have a Cold War resulting immediately after World War II. Big thing that happens is nuclear weapons proliferate. We'll get a little into how that happens, but famously the US uses nuclear weapons in Japan as a show of strength to say to Europe, hey, we have these weapons just for future reference, don't attack us. But Russia starts to develop nuclear weapons. They start to develop in quite a few other countries, and they spread around and they proliferate. Communism is viewed as a global scourge in the US. It's spreading to different countries, and the US is starting to intervene in these countries to fight it and prevent it from spreading. So this is where you get the Korean War, the Vietnam War, a lot of the efforts in Central and South America, Cuban Missile Crisis, invasion of Grenada. All of these things happen as a result of us fighting communism spread, trying to stop it because it's a global scourge that we need to do whatever we can to prevent happening. This also sees the development of NATO and containment. NATO is a French acronym, but it's about the North Atlantic, all the states in there. So the US and most of Europe joined together against Russia. We'll get more into NATO later on, but their focus was to fight against Russia's spread of communism and deter the use of military force between the US and Russia because we have a lot of nuclear weapons. And if one of us starts firing them, the world does not do well. So while this is going on in the global affairs of this Cold War, spying is happening in the US and Russia like mad. I'll talk a little bit more about the spying that's happening in the US. It's a little more interesting. I mean, we just have CIA agents working undercover. That's the big secret of what's happening in Russia. But spying was the norm between both countries. Whittaker Chambers, very famously, was a Russian communist subverter spy in the US who defected and turned and became good old American capitalist. And he ended up outing Alger Hiss and a group identified as the Ware Group as communist interlopers, plotting to basically overthrow the US and in part to steal information about nuclear weapons to get to Russia. That was ultimately successful by a different group of spies getting information stolen from the US to Russia about nuclear weapons. So there was in fact a series of communist spies seeking to undermine America. And this led, of course, famously to Joseph McCarthy's illustrious career. 2 weeks after Alger Hiss was convicted of perjury for lying to Congress about being a communist, Joe McCarthy made his famous speech, which launched his entire career as a communist hunter, about how we need to rout out communists. He did in fact get some, but many people he outed or he alleged were communists weren't shown as communists. He alleged to have a document listing names that did not exist, and ultimately he caused quite a bit of harm. But there were some of the nails he hit were in fact communist. So it was a mixed bag, but generally it led to a lot of blacklisting and blackballing in Hollywood of celebrities not being able to make movies as a result of allegations of communism. But this all fixes with Ronnie Reagan. I'm being a little facetious, but the Soviet Union does collapse under his watch. His famous tear down this wall speech is, as referenced here, gives you a sense of kind of the efforts pushed to end this kind of separation of Germany and the separation occurring under communism where countries aren't able to coexist. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, there are only really 3 officially communist countries. There's Cuba still, China technically, China allegedly, and North Korea are all officially communist. Other countries have communist aspects, but don't run quite the same and aren't still holdovers from the Soviet era. So a lot of ultimately it did look like capitalism won with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. But as I talked about earlier, NATO still exists. So NATO was specifically designed, again, as I said, to kind of contain the spread of communism. We see Russia owns all these satellite states, all these states around it are part of the Soviet Union, and they want to spread communism and take over the world effectively. So the US and Europe are like, okay, we're going to unite together against Russia. And so they formed NATO. And one of the most important aspects of NATO is Article 5, which I have presented here. And the underlying parts are the most important aspects of that. Basically, an armed attack against one or more of them is considered an attack against them all. If Russia attacks, if the Soviet Union were to attack the UK, we take it the same as if the Soviet Union blew up a bomb in New York. It's an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. We're all united. Any aggression against us will be meted with aggression from all of us. So this makes a lot of sense, you know, to kind of counter the Warsaw Pact in the USSR, where any attack on a country in the USSR is considered an attack on the communist regime. We have this little counterbalance, but the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. Ronald Reagan saw to it, remember? It collapsed in 1991. So this is a map showing that NATO hasn't collapsed. It's still there and it's still growing. So on the left, you see in 1990, this is what NATO looked like when the Soviet Union still existed. The Soviet Union is all the blue, NATO's all the red. And now this map on the right is since 2014. There are 2 additional countries that have been added to it since 2014, Montenegro in 2017 and North Macedonia in 2020. But I mean, what does it look like? It looks like NATO's still sticking around and it's moving closer to Russia. Famously, the Ukraine wants to join NATO. Georgia, Georgia's also trying to join NATO. Georgia's the country, not Georgia the state. And there's a lot of efforts for NATO to expand into the other countries because they know that if they're parts of NATO, Russia is not going to want to attack them. You know, Russia very famously took over parts of Crimea, which we can get into later, because they knew that if they took parts of Crimea, the US wasn't going to attack them because Ukraine's not part of NATO. But if they want to take over a section of Romania or they want to move into Lithuania, that's problematic for them. Those countries are parts of NATO, and any aggression there will be considered an attack on the United States, which Russia does not want to do. So just to give you a sense of how NATO has continued to exist and expand, even without the enemy they were founded existing. Let us move on to theories of global politics. These are the 3 we'll be discussing in this lecture: realism, democratic peace theory, and structuralism. A couple of would be impressive if you can recognize the image on the right. It is from Dr. Seuss's Butter Battle book, which I think this is from the cartoon adaptation of it, which is a pretty much an example of how realism works and really the Cold War, as explained by Dr. Seuss, because he was actually a pretty smart political theorist. So let's start with the state of the world. The world is anarchy. Right now, there is no global government. There's a government in the US, so if I were to do something that the US government has said is illegal, they can send police to come and arrest me and take me to court and try me and put me in jail for breaking their law. But the state of the world is that there is no world government. There's no ultimate authority that can control what any one country does to another country. There's really just agreements that are only as strong as the countries that agree to them want them to be. There's no ultimate power, and because there's no ultimate power, there's different ways countries can interact with each other because they have no restrictions on them. So the first way to view that is realism, which is the focus on power, that international politics is shaped by power. What that means is if my country is the strongest, I get to set the rules of the game. If I'm the US and I say that, it's illegal to do a trade with North Korea, then if another country wants to do trade with North Korea, I can blow them up basically. And what are they going to do to stop me? I have more nuclear weapons, I'm stronger than them. Now there are countries that can say, well, I have a lot of power too. Russia and China. China, most famously for the North Korea example, can say, we're going to do the trade we want with North Korea, and what are you going to do to stop us? We have a lot of missiles too. And the US goes, okay, China can do trade with North Korea, but no other country can. And all the other countries go, yeah, we don't have nuclear weapons, so we're going to listen to the US. So to spoil the ending of the presentation is realism is always considered an aspect of your international policy view in the US. Even if you subscribe to the other theories, in the back of your mind, there's always the understanding that ultimately, if the US has missiles, they get to set the rules of the table, and other countries that have missiles get to just agree with the rules we set. But with realism, you get deterrence, which is, again, you have the missiles, you get to make sure other people aren't doing things you don't want them to do, and bandwagoning, which is I'm a country that doesn't have nuclear weapons. I'm Spain, but the U.S. has nuclear weapons. They think we should not have trade with North Korea. Well, I'll agree with them. I'm going to bandwagon and join on with this stronger country, so that they know that I'm a friend of you. You don't have to worry about us. Never have to worry about threatening us. So these are the kind of the aspects that shake out from realism. Next is democratic peace theory. So this sees international politics kind of being focused more on organizations and cooperation between different countries. So you have the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, World Bank. These are international institutions, and they try to formalize rules because they understand that if there's a way for countries to deal with issues internationally through conversation or through arbitration, then you don't need to have missiles flying between countries. If there's a dispute between Germany and Czechoslovakia about the population of German people living there, instead of Adolf Hitler having to annex the Sudetenland and instigate World War II, he could maybe go to an arbitrator and say, hey, these German citizens want to be part of Germany, maybe we should do something about that. So maybe that would have worked to prevent World War II, maybe not. But people who subscribe to democratic peace theory see that it's good to have these institutions as an option, as a way to vent off steam without things having to build up to a war breaking out. And this is also further bolstered by the belief that democracies don't fight one another. Now this is kind of true, since in general, democracies are less likely to fight one another, but there have been examples. I can go through them if you want. They're just in the 20th century alone. There's been more than a dozen examples of democracies fighting each other. The Balkan War, the Yugoslav Wars, Turkish invasion of Cyprus, the Six-Day War. Kashmir wars, there Polish-Lithuanian wars. There have been examples, but in general, it is true that democracies are less likely to fight one another. Now, moving on to the next political worldview is constructivism. This is more focused on a meta-narrative. So it's a little complicated way of saying that the ideas of the people share between countries. So instead of realism focusing on power and democratic peace theory focusing on, democracies, this is focused on shared traits between countries. So if multiple countries consider power important, for example, Russia and the US share a view that it's important to have nuclear weapons and deterrence, then they can build bonds based on those shared principles, whatever they may be. If it's about caring about the environment, if two countries really care about caring about the environment, they can form a coalition together on these shared values. They construct their values and are able to share them. This is a Garfield comic that if it doesn't make you laugh, congratulations, I think that means you're normal. It's a terrible one, but it explains it. Basically how constructivism works is, you're constructing around whether or not we should cook based off of our shared values of a chef hat. But which theory is correct? I included this slide to make things a little more relevant. I don't know about you, but I am a big Marvel Avengers fan. And a couple of years ago, Captain America Civil War came out, the best of all the Marvel movies. And it's the best because it's basically these three principles in action. The big issue in the movie is realism versus democratic peace theory versus constructivism. Realism is Captain America, who says, the Avengers should be able to project their power because we're the good guys and we're going to fight the bad guys, and we need to be able to act quickly when there's bad guys. Tony Stark is a believer in democratic peace theory. There was that Sokovia Accords. We have to agree to democracies having a say over us. We have to let people decide when to use the power of the Avengers instead of us deciding arbitrarily. And then, Ultron and Vision, the AI to take over protect the world and destroy the world, are more about the values, the value of protecting people, which was what Tony Stark built them on. So this movie it may seem like action and superheroes, but there's some pretty good themes on international relations. So I suggest watching it again and considering how these different views play out in international relations and which one you agree with the most. So now let's get into the US's interest. So we're going to talk about their military, political, ideological, and economic interests.
Wait just a second.
Military interests. Oh,
can I send it as a poll?
Sure.
Okay. It's ready. Go.
Okay. Awesome. Poll's ready, so make sure you do that. Military interest, safe American homeland. We got to prevent attacks. The military doesn't want any country attacking the US. That's ultimately the prime goal of the military, is to make sure there's not a foreign country sending in troops or bombs to the US and hurting people. And the security of our institutions, this is doubled up in efforts and after the 2016 elections, with Russia attempting to sway the results of the election. So the security of our institutions is also very important to protect it from cyber attacks from hostile foreign powers, hacking of GPS satellites, hacking of the electrical system, all these systems, making sure that they are secure and strong in the US. And the preservation of US dominance. So I don't know if you've heard, but the US is kind of a big deal in the global world, and what we say kind of goes. That's because we're big and strong and people listen to us. And so the military wants to maintain that edge, that we don't have the US having to listen to what other countries say. We can agree with other countries, with the UN, but ultimately, if every other country says one thing, the US can go, that's nice, we're the US, and we're gonna keep using the feet and yards instead of the metric system, as an example, a silly example. And maintaining military access is the connection between the US military and other militaries for security reasons. There's a lot of joint military actions between the US and Europe, for example, and South Korea, to show that, we have access to their militaries, they have access to some of our military stuff, and so to preserve security, if we're working with the South Korean military, North Korea is less likely to blow up Seoul, for example, the capital of South Korea. Political interest, save American homeland. You know, the goal of foreign policy for every president, every member of Congress, everyone involved in politics is, again, like I said, you don't want bombs blowing up in the United States. People elect leaders for a lot of things, but the number one reason you want for the government is to make sure when you're going to classes, the streets don't blow up. You don't want that. That trumps everything. To use the Trump word, but that is above every other issue. And so this is a major consideration for any politician for the goal of foreign policy. So again, securing the political institutions, making sure our elections are legitimate, and maintaining the security of the people, that, you know, people are able to go to work and to visit family and friends without, you know, explosions happening. Ideological interest, we're securing our institutions, but we're also promoting our success of our institutions internationally and encouraging the development of democracies abroad. And so these two pictures are some of my favorite examples. This is the statue built of the goddess of democracy. So on the left, this is the statue that was built by Chinese protesters, very famously in Tiananmen Square, when protesting the Chinese government. They built this statue to promote the development of democracy in their country. And on the right is another statue of the goddess of democracy that was built by the Hong Kong protesters, again protesting China, arguing for a desire for democracy over Hong Kong to secure themselves. And so the US supports these kind of movements and these movements abroad of democracies and democratization of other countries, and seeing that occur. So we want to see that happen, make a liberal world order, liberal small L, meaning freedom for individuals, and promote cooperation and free trade between these countries. And building off of that is our economic interest, which historically is open markets, so free market trade between countries to maintain our economic growth, as Dr. Rowlett talked about last week, how, you know, important how big our markets are, our GDP is because of how much trade we do. And so we wanted to encourage that. That's changed a little under Trump, which I'll get to in a little bit. But overall, this has historically been the primary economic interest of the United States, and would almost certainly be what Joe Biden would like to see when he becomes president. So moving on, just to give you little examples of military spending in the US. These are two graphs. This one shows the total amount of US spending for the US, I believe, in 2018. So this will give you a sense of how much the US has spent on the military compared to all these other countries combined, not spending as much. So to give you a sense, the US spends a lot of money on their military. So you may be thinking, hey, that's kind of crazy. We're spending so much money. China's spending, you know, 200 billion. We're spending 3 times that. Maybe we could spend a little less. But you have to also consider, as Dr. Rowlett mentioned last week, we have a much bigger economy than every other country. Our GDP is huge. So when you take that into account and you look at our military budgets compared to our GDP, we're actually only spending about 3.2%. Saudi Arabia spends the most, which, you know, makes sense. You know, they're currently waging a war in Yemen, and their entire GDP is focused exclusively on the oil markets, which aren't doing too great as of today. So this percentage has probably gone up since then. I believe this is in 2018 as well. Yeah. So their percentage has probably increased drastically. But when you look at other countries, we're actually not spending that crazy of amount. Historically, 3% of GDP is the ideal spending on military, but that does fluctuate and change. So this is something to consider when you consider the US military budget in terms of our economy. Now, let's talk about some of the modern presidents. I'm just going to talk about the ones from 2000 to today and in the near future to give you a sense of what foreign policies look like and how it's changed recently. Probably, I imagine most of your lives will be contained within these past presidents, I imagine. But, you know, some of you might be a little older, we'll see. But President George W. Bush became president 2001 to 2009. He, if you can believe it, campaigned on less interventionist foreign policy. He actually was kind of focusing more on, we'll have economics and trade, but we don't need the US military abroad. We don't need to be involved in other countries' affairs, let other countries deal with their things and we'll deal with our things and we'll all just trade and be happy. And that lasted for, a couple months, and then 9/11 happened. And suddenly things changed. 9/11 permanently changed US foreign policy irreconcilably. It'll never go back to the way it was before, but it began the war on terror, the US efforts to eliminate terrorism abroad and to continue on making the world safe for democracy and seeing the US as the leader of the world in preserving democracy or building democracies abroad. So I also have included a list of the wars began by George W. Bush and their timeframes. The war in Afghanistan, of course, is still going on, began in 2001. Invasion of Iraq was in 2001. The Iraq War was for 8 years. War in Northwest Pakistan, a lot of droning is happening there from 2004 and still going on. And the second intervention in the Somali Civil War. This is Somalia has historically had a lot of violence and struggled to maintain a cohesive, governmental system there. This will continue on under the next president, who was President Barack Obama. So a little background before he became president, he campaigned on opposing the Iraq War. He, of course, was first elected as from Chicago, and he ran in an extremely liberal district where he wouldn't have been elected unless he had campaigned on opposing the Iraq War. But he was put in office after the vote, so he never actually got to vote of the Iraq War. But he campaigned when he was running for president against the excesses of the previous administration. So he's like, the Bush program, they're torturing people in Guantanamo Bay. We need to close Guantanamo Bay. We need to rein in this war. We need to end these forever wars. We need to do what we can to reduce, American military involvement. And then he got elected, and things didn't really happen. He made some efforts to close Guantanamo Bay, but he ran into the problem of these people are accused of terrorism. Where do you put them? Do you find a state that wants to have terrorists in their jails? You can't. But none of the states would have wanted them. So it was very difficult. And ultimately, he was unable to close Guantanamo Bay. It still operates to this day. And he continued on many of the policies of George Bush, expanding the drone warfare policy that Bush had started, and utilizing some of the same torture methods Bush had started for a while, until ultimately limiting them to some capacity. These are the wars that began under President Barack Obama. So Operation Ocean Shield, which was an effort to control the Somali pirates, the war in Libya, war efforts in Uganda, American-led intervention in Iraq, which is kind of a return to Iraq, American-led intervention in Syria, the Yemeni civil war, where the U.S. provided the blockade while Saudi Arabia attacked Yemen, and American intervention in Libya. So quite a few wars started under President Barack Obama. And next we turn to President Donald Trump, who's still the current president. So he's the most complex foreign policy stance of all the presidents. He is opposed to the Iraq War and campaigned against the wastefulness of current wars, that these wars are stupid, we shouldn't be involved in. And to his credit, he's the first president in 40 years to not involve the U.S. in another war. I mean, he's still got a couple of weeks, so you never know what he might do to surprise us. But as of yet, he hasn't involved us in another war. But he did continue, Bush and Obama wars, and ramped up the violent efforts against ISIS. So he bombed the Syrian airport with Tomahawk missiles. He assassinated the leader of the basically the terrorist wing of the military of Iran, the Quds Force. But he was more focused in general on economic policy. So he was more focused on using trade as a weapon. So this is the kind of his ideas behind economic war with China, which is we have tariffs and trade. This hurts both our countries, but it hurts China more. And it allows the US to advance, negotiate, and leverage its power against China instead of having to use military force, using economic force. And he wanted to reduce US hegemony or control of the world and see other countries addressing their own problems, most famously through NATO. He wanted to see other countries paying for the maintenance of NATO. Every country is supposed to pay 2% of their GDP. The US has been footing the bill in a lot of parts. Remember, our GDP is much larger. So, but, other countries were not involving as much in NATO as we would like. So President Trump was very effortful in trying to see that resolved. And finally, President-elect Joe Biden focused on strengthening, he campaigned on focusing and strengthening our Democratic allies, kind of a return to what we had with Obama, instead of, Donald Trump kind of undermining, NATO and these international institutions. He wants to see the US as a leader in a multilateral world where everyone's working together. He campaigned on ending these forever wars. If you look at his campaign website, he says, we got to draw down these troops in the Middle East, focus on Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but, we don't need to be in this war in Yemen. We don't need to have all these unnecessary troops in the Middle East stationed there for decades and decades. So that's what he's campaigned on. But, one of the benefits of Joe Biden is he's been in politics for forever. So you can look at kind of what his votes have been. He did vote in favor of the authorization of military force in Iraq. So he voted in favor of what ultimately was the instigator for the Iraq wars. And if you want to go back in time, he voted in favor of military strikes in Serbia, Syria, and Libya in 1999. Again, Joe Biden's been in politics for years. So you can look at his record on Vietnam. He had a different record on the War of 1812, but he's been around. So, you can get a good sense of him. And with that, I believe that is my presentation. So do we have any questions?
Any questions for Will? I'll tell you guys where you were with what you thought on international theories. 53% of you favored the democratic peace theory, 37% realism, and 10% constructivism. Coulter, I don't know if you can see the board, Will, says that was cool and good job. And Evie feels like she has a lot more knowledge now.
Happy to help.
All right, everybody say thank you to Will.
Thanks, Will.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it, Will.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Shout out that boy, Will.
Yes, sir.
All right, and so until Wednesday, boomer.
Sooner.